So I'm just going to kick things off here. Just a little intro. In preparing for this conference, which is so incredibly well organized by Emily and Michaela and others, I just said, what do you think would be valuable for people, for audiences? And we came up with this title that you see today. And then I thought about who might be some really great speakers, and I remember seeing a fantastic presentation by the CEO of UpMetrics, and I was just knocked out by everything they do as it relates to showing what impact is. And so as it relates to impact, I think we as people who are working with donors, we want to make sure donors keep coming back and they feel satisfied and they feel fulfilled. And so what does showing progress look like to them? What does showing impact look like? And so we want to be sensitive to that and try to figure out, well, how can I deliver on that? What would be meaningful? And again, what would be that positive cycle that we give them what they're looking for from an impact standpoint, and they reward by either giving more money, more time, more resources, and then it's just, again, a really incredible positive feedback loop, and then it just continues on and on. So that's really the impetus behind inviting Annie and Briana today to come and talk. And so with that, I'll just hand it over to either Annie or Briana just to take it away.
Thank you, Rick. And to reiterate what Rick said, what a great opportunity for us. We're excited to be here. This session is about all of you, and we want to make sure you're walking away with something. We want it to be interactive. So we hope you light up the chat box, and we have some poll questions in just a moment. We're going to go through some, like why today is the day to really embrace and use your impact data to communicate with your donors. Briana is going to take us through a methodology that we approach working with our clients around, we call decal, but it's really about defining what is important to you, what is important to your donors, collecting what data do you have, what data do you need, analyzing, how do you know how you're doing towards your goals? How are you leveraging this information? How are you sharing it out? And then we're going to have a Q&A between Briana and Rick, so we can hear more from Rick about his experience in working with donors and where he is at this moment in time in sharing data out. And then we'll have an open Q&A at the end for everyone. So again, actively connect with us in the chat box with questions you have, what's working, what's not working in terms of communicating with your donors. So we're going to kick off with some trends. So just sharing with you where the world of donors and communicating with donors, you know this better than anyone. You're living this in your day-to-day. We know giving grew over the past year. We know the age of donors has actually increased with 2 years to 64 years old in the past year. We know female donors are more likely to make a donation based on data that they're receiving. So getting that connection to you and the work that you're doing. And no surprise to any of you here that annual giving, the top month is December. When it comes to volunteer and giving trends, we know that 67% of worldwide donors choose to volunteer in their local communities. This is important to you. For myself, a new mom, and Briana, an almost new mom, we were excited to learn that moms age 35 to 44 were last year's top volunteer group. We also know that volunteers and your donors are looking for more transparent and authentic communications. And we'll get a little bit more into the why people give. So that was from an overarching donors. Thinking about foundations, and that's where Rick and my experience has been as my experience has been, foundations are really trying to make it easier to do business with their grant partners. And many across the foundation landscape have committed to really loosening those restrictions around their current grants. Now, you'll say to me, I can't wait to see that, and I'll say it back to you. I really want to see them actually put the money where these words are. But what's important here is that they still need data and they still need information from you. And that information is really going to be around impact. The other thing to mention here is that rise of donor advised funds. This is important because the donors are actually your donors who are finding that they have a vehicle to give through their donor advised funds. So we're seeing more and more donor advised funds creeping up. So what do donors want? And again, you know this in your day-to-day, but really the research is showing us they want clarity and communications from you. They want to feel connection. They want to know their impact with their dollars to you. They want to know your impact, and they want there to be transparency between you and the organization. We've put sources throughout the session today, and we've included them in the last pages of today's presentation. So you'll have access to the slides and all of the sources that are in here. So with that, we're going to ask you your first poll question is, are you using data to communicate with your donors today? Okay, that's great. So yes, we're ahead of the game here. Some of you are using data today to communicate with your donors. That's important to your donors. That's what they're looking to you for. Others of you are no, we're not sure, and we're trying to figure that out. And so we'll talk more about that as we move through. Did I share the results out? Look at that. And then I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, I'm going to move us here. So data, we're living in it. We're increasing the amount of data we're as individuals and as households are consuming yearly by 2 times. Every year, we're consuming more and more data. So how do we stand out in our message to our donors in all of that data that they're consuming on a daily basis? So it's going to take us to our second poll question is, for those of you that do share data with your donors and your funders, what types of data are you sharing? Is it storytelling? Is it impact measurement? Is it program design? Is it fundraising? Is it resource allocation? Is it learning? We're seeing the results come in, and it looks like it's really across the board: storytelling, impact measurement, program design, fundraising, resource allocation, learning. Oh, this is great. I'm going to pause us there and share the results out. So you can see this is really across the board in terms of the types of data that everyone today is sharing with their donors. And this is fabulous. This is better than any other conversation I've had in a very long time, just in terms of sharing data and the types of data to share out. So just one more set of details on trends, and this is really related to the donor volunteer trends that you're thinking about this whole week at the conference. But really, most popular months to give. Wanted to call out December, November, and June because there are a few pieces of ahas that we want you to walk away with from today, and you can apply that to your June campaigns. We know that 62% of charitable donors are also volunteers, so that your volunteers that are showing up to help you with your work and programs and events are also going to be the ones that are looking to see that impact data, looking to learn where their dollars are going and what their impact is. And then 39% of your volunteers support a nonprofit by volunteering before they make a financial donation. So just, thinking with that mindset in terms of the ways you're interacting and what those volunteers need to learn in order to give those dollars. So final poll question is, what types of data will spark a donor to give? Storytelling, impact, program design, fundraising, resource allocation, learning. And you can see we're really sticking with these key themes that we'll talk about today in terms of how you can use this data and how you can capture this data. So I'm just doing a quick one. I'll share those results out. Again, we're seeing it across the board, but we're seeing the storytelling and impact really along the top. You all did your homework. We're good here. It's storytelling and impact data that your donors want to see, your volunteers want to see, your leadership and board want to see, and it really connects to that emotion to spark that give. So data really drives so much, and I want to pause here for a moment because it's your mission. I'm going to talk about data from the most enthusiastic place. Briana and Rick will talk about the same. Your mission is really at the center of everything. What we strongly believe, though, is that the tracking your data, managing your data, and really embracing it to learn can help drive so many things for your organization. And really here is that thinking about that fundraising, that donor, how do we get the data to them that will spark them to give, that will motivate them to talk about your mission, that will get them to volunteer with you at the next event. Before I turn it over to Briana, I'm looking for Briana and Rick. Nice smiles, thumbs up. Before I turn it over to Briana to take us through our deep dive around decal, we first wanted to talk about types of data to use. And it's important to start here for us because we're talking about data, and data can mean so many things to so many different people. So we wanted to talk about quantitative data and qualitative data. So quantitative data is the data we're often thinking about. It's the data we spend a lot of time in. It's what can be counted, measured, expressed using numbers. Quantitative data you're collecting today, your donor information, you're collecting your volunteer information, you're collecting your program information, and it's helping you answer the key questions of who are you serving, what have you done for those clients, for those constituents, when, where, why. It will help you really understand what has happened in the past and what needs to happen. It'll help you stay on track for achieving your goals. It's primarily a number. It's a goal that you set out. It's an outcome. It's an indicator. It's a milestone that along the way will help you understand whether you're on the right path. When we talk about qualitative data, often, let me pause there. When we talk about data, we spend the majority of our time talking about that quantitative data. And so we wanted to make sure we shared with you today that we're also talking about qualitative data when we're talking about data. So the qualitative data really describes the qualities or characteristics of the who. It's the story, it's the anecdote, it's what often doesn't get captured in the nonprofit sector, in the philanthropy sector as a whole, in the impact sector as a whole. that qualitative data lives in people's minds and their brains. It might be in your email, it might be on social media, it might be a text to say, as a program participant, I had an amazing time today. It's not a number, you're not capturing it in that way, but it helps you bring together the story of your data. And I often say that the qualitative data really helps the quantitative data come to life. It helps you track trends over time. It helps you understand the themes across the communities that you're working in and working with. It can include things like feedback loops and surveys. It can include something like the poll questions we asked earlier. It could be articles, blogs, a change of policy. It could be a photo, a video, a link. Just wanted to spark your mind in terms of qualitative data and how you're thinking about it at your organization, how it's collected, where it lives, and if there's ever change of staff or change of who you're serving, did you capture that story so you have it for the long term? I don't need to tell you that today's world is complex, and stories are now at the moment. It's our moment to capture them and to tell them and to share, and again, bring that data to life. What we've learned from donors, funders, and across the board is that quantitative data is really important to them, but they're also looking for that qualitative data. And again, how people learn and digest information, sharing both is going to be critical in capturing their attention. It's important to have both the quantitative and qualitative to tell the story, and it also is a way of engaging your stakeholders in your story of impact. Why stories? It helps you share complex ideas that are hard or you're not able to tell from a quantitative perspective. It helps you inspire members, your volunteers, your board, other members of your staff, and it can help you give a balance around the data that you're collecting. We strongly believe that stories inspire action, whether that action is with funding or volunteers or even internally at your own organization. We also believe that the secret to a good story is in your data and strategy. So making sure you're sharing your mission in that story, finding that balance of qualitative and quantitative, putting that data in a context so that your stakeholder or who you're sharing it with can understand, and then also make sure that you're providing some level of a story arc to help guide that recipient or receiver of that story on where you want them to land, whether that arc lands them on engage with the organization more, or here's the quantitative data to look through and or a donate now button at the end of that. In the realm of using that qualitative data to stand up your quantitative data, what you're seeing here is an example of, on the left is what we often communicate to our donors and to our communities to let them know what we've accomplished. What have we done? What are we really excited about? We did this. We've served 27 families. We had 210 volunteer hours this past month. 4 families graduated from our program. And what we're encouraging through today's session is really thinking about how you can weave that quantitative data on the left-hand side into that story. So use the story of Angela and her family to help stand up all of that quantitative data. Angela and her family were one of 4 families that graduated from our program this month. Of the 27 families in our community, just saying that first sentence there, it's very different than my communicating that we serve 27 families. It connects to different synapses in different ways that I'm going to learn and receive the information that you're trying to share with us. Okay, with that, I probably spoke longer than Briana and Rick planned for me to speak, but I got super excited about this topic. I'm going to go live into the chat and hand the controls over to Briana, who's going to walk us through the path to becoming data-driven.
Awesome. Thanks, Annie. Cool. Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here today and really excited to chat with you. I wanted to say that as I go through this methodology for becoming data-driven, please feel free, if you have any questions, to type them into the chat. Like Annie said, she'll be you know, in the chat too, but we'll have some time at the end to answer questions and to discuss. So if you have any questions that come up, pop them right in there and we'll know to get to them. And you'll see that I already started to do that. I can't ever tell if my use of the chat is distracting during these kinds of presentations, but sometimes I just have a burning question that I want to pose to the group. So as Annie shared, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about our methodology at UpMetrics for effectively measuring impact, and in particular encouraging our partners and the organizations that we work with to become data-driven. And the methodology that we use is called DECAL. It stands for Define, Collect, Analyze, and Leverage. And this is the methodology that I implement as a client manager at UpMetrics. But I was really excited to find that these were also a sort of simplified version of the steps that I had to take with organizations before I joined UpMetrics when I worked as a clinical research coordinator. And so that is really, you know, working in a different capacity to do clinical evaluations with organizations on the ground. But it's really similar steps that you have to take in order to effectively collect and measure impact. So it's really exciting to be continuing to use them. You can go ahead to the next slide. Thanks. So the first step, define, is really about honing in on what key data points and metrics your organization needs to understand your impact and then to track progress towards your goals. And taking the time to really think through this first step is really helpful because it ensures that everybody on your team and at your organization is going to be collecting the same data. They're going to be aligned on what data is being collected. And that really makes it possible to establish some level of baseline, to then track trends and to measure progress with your team. Go ahead to the next slide. We usually use like a fruit or like a code word to change slide. I'll probably just start doing that so I don't say it every single time. But you know, what usually comes up in this first step of the process is this question of, you know, what data do we collect? What's important to us? What's going to be important to our donors? And sometimes that data, those metrics are already defined at the organization that you're working with. And sometimes you have to work with your donors in partnership to establish what those are going to be. But what's really interesting is you'll see here, there's a graph, obviously, that's showing that 73% of some group thought that outcomes were important and 50% of some group thought that impact on constituents were important. But this was actually from a survey that UpMetrics did last year. And the purpose was really to kind of establish a baseline of what collaboration looked like in the sector for nonprofits and foundations. So a variety of those kinds of organizations participated in a survey and really all aligned on outcomes being prioritized when evaluating the success of a program and impact on constituents being valued. And that impact on constituents, that's that qualitative data that Annie was talking about. That's that story. And it's so meaningful because it provides additional context and it connects you and your donors and your other stakeholders to the outcomes that you're going to be reporting on. And those outcomes are generally going to be, and we can talk a little bit more about this in the Q&A at the end. But what are those, changes that you really expected to see in the population that you are serving because of the program activities that you're performing, or that the intervention that you're doing? So some of these are expected results, but sometimes outcomes are not necessarily exactly what you expected, and you kind of get to that point in some of the later steps of decal. You'll see that I included a little.
Briana,
I'm sorry, Annie.
Excuse me, Briana. Yeah, I was just going to say, I hate to interrupt, but there is a question on this slide from someone, Lauren, who asks, can you explain the difference between outcomes versus outputs? The two different bar charts you have there are two different bars.
Yeah. So Annie, how do you best describe outputs? I kind of think of the outcomes as those expected results, that you actually thought were going to come from your program activities, from the intervention. Outputs, generally, we sometimes think about this like in sort of like a phase or sort of like a track. I can kind of visualize it because I'm that visual person. And outputs are coming before your outcomes happened. They're kind of like the result of the pieces that you put into place, like to actually implement your program. Annie can probably paraphrase this in a better way than I'm doing right now, but a way to think about it, and I'll kind of explain it with an example of maybe an organization that provides meals to the community. The very first part of that is going to be like the food, the raw pieces that are going to go into putting that meal together. And then an output is going to be the number of meals that you served to the community, maybe in a week or that month. And then your outcome is, what's the expected result from that? And sometimes it's a little bigger. It's some sort of behavioral change. It might be a knowledge change in your participants. And so that is a little bit more potentially, interesting sometimes, I think, to not just donors, but organizations too, because they're starting to get closer to that impact data. It's a little bit less about the nuts and bolts that are actually going into the program and getting just a little step further into, what kind of impact is this really having on the community? And that's why coupling it with the qualitative data, the story, can be really powerful, because you're really bringing that connection, that emotion to the impact data that you're starting to report about. How does that feel as a response? Okay, we're getting a thumbs up and some nods. Okay.
Very good. Thank you. Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you.
Okay, we can skip to the next slide. I'll share an example soon. Awesome. So once you've kind of defined, what key data points you think you need to collect, you really, know are going to be important for you to understand your organization's progress, we're starting to move into the collect phase. And this is about actually, outlining a game plan to collect that data. Maybe you're already collecting it and you just need to start to gather it, identify where it is, and identify who's actually doing it. And then start to think of a way to, centralize that into one place. Blueberry. Or next slide. Thanks. So one of the things that we sometimes do with our partner organizations is to start to think through maybe what does this data collection landscape look like? And not everybody has to, create some sort of Excel document to keep track of their data, but the questions that are here are really, really important in this collect phase. And after you've defined what you need and want to collect, understanding if you actually collect it already, where it lives, how often you collect or update it, and what kind of data it is really helpful. If you find that there was something on that initial defined list that you're not already collecting, you can also use this sort of phase of the methodology to think about the best ways for you to start collecting it. And we have a lot of those conversations with our partners as well. Next. Analyze is when things start to get a little bit fun. At UpMetrics, maybe, obviously, maybe not, but we are really encouraging organizations to centralize data, because oftentimes organizations are collecting data in different systems. It lives in different places. It might be in different formats, which makes it really difficult to combine and compare and to really get meaningful and measurable insights from it. So taking some time to understand what the format of your data is so that you can, put it all together in one place is really powerful. And so oftentimes that leads to leveraging some sort of platform to visualize your data so that you can start to understand a little bit more deeply what's happening. Next slide. Cool. So what does it look like to analyze your data? I had to include some sort of visualizations. A lot of people might be familiar with making charts or graphs in Excel, putting together infographics, or using some other kind of system to really look at your data and see what's coming out of it. But oftentimes what happens in this analyze phase at UpMetrics is that the organizations start learning from that data right away. And some of the questions that I put on the slide are ones that, I pose in conversation. How does what you see here measure up to your expectations? How does your progress compare to the baseline numbers? And is there any data missing that you need to better understand your impact? And sometimes, getting that first look at your data can be really exciting, or maybe just starting to dive a little deeper into a subset of your data if you've already seen it can be really exciting. But it can also start to bring up challenges when maybe it's not exactly what you expected to see, or you're starting to maybe identify gaps. And I included the logo of an organization that I work with called Women's Employment Network to remind me to tell this story. And it's interesting learning because the organization was really ready when we had these conversations about defining key data needs and what was important for the organization to collect and track. They identified those metrics, they identified those stories, and they knew where it all lived. They were pretty mature in terms of their data collection practices. And so we got to, analyzing the data really quickly. But when they actually saw it, they were able to see that there were, a number of metrics that were missing for large portions of the clients that they serve, which impacted, of course, the story that they're able to tell. And so they were encouraged to go back to the collect phase and start to rethink what that data collection game plan really looked like. And what they discovered is that, some of the data collection tools that they were using, whether it was an intake form for new clients that were coming to the organization, or it was a database that staff was using to track interactions with clients, there were a number of fields in those data collection forms that were optional to fill out, which then can lead to some information, being missing when you start to actually look at it in a format like this. So they were able to identify, well, what is the data we really need to collect to drive learning among our staff and improve the, programs that our organization is providing to the community? What would be nice to have, to understand that better? What do we need? And what do we really need to report to our board on a quarterly basis? What do they need to, go out and talk about what we're doing to their stakeholders, to the community, to potentially, increase their funding? So interestingly, sometimes we get to this analyze phase and you take a couple steps back to regroup and understand again, what do we really need? What do we want? Where are those gaps? And again, how can we align as a team, leadership and staff, to really establish a system that's going to ensure consistency and reliability in the information that they want to use to tell their story? It doesn't always happen like that. Sometimes you see the data and it's clean and it's full, and what you have is really already exciting, and you can use it to understand more about your program and keep moving forward. But it's always worth being open to that possibility that you might have to rethink, what some of the process was up to this point. Next. Leverage. Okay, this is step 4 of the method at UpMetrics. And, really once we get to a point where you've measured performance, the next steps are to learn and adapt based on the information. The example that I shared about Women's Employment Network was for them to learn about their internal process and to potentially take action on that internally so that they could tell a more full story. But sometimes leveraging the data is going to move directly to driving impact and combining that quantitative and qualitative data to tell your story externally, to work to attract capital, to help hit your goals, to scale your impact. So leveraging can really, be in all directions. And that's one of the things that I get really excited about, because I've always been very interested in, acknowledging the challenges and barriers that exist to really efficient programming and being able to, develop and provide innovative programming to the community. And oftentimes leveraging for me is about that internal learning. But the other side of it, and of course, what we're talking about today, is really getting to that point where you're using it to communicate, with your stakeholders and with your donors. Next slide. Excuse me. Thank you. So what we really like to focus on, at UpMetrics, and what Annie, talked about before, and what many of you are already doing based on the polls, which is really exciting, is to leverage data to tell your story. What that looks like is to really combine, the qualitative and the quantitative data side by side. And this is an example of what that might look like in terms of numbers. Annie shared with you a narrative example earlier of what that might look like. A lot of organizations that we work with can start to really use that kind of that narrative that is giving the hard numbers, the quantitative, with a little bit of that story in reporting that they have to do on a regular basis. And that's a really exciting way to share some of that with your funders on a regular basis and to potentially get feedback. But I always like to encourage organizations to consider including that, direct impact on your constituents. So maybe it's testimonials or quotes, might be anecdotes from your staff or volunteers, right, who are working with the community. Relevant media that centers your constituents is also really powerful. Photos with permission, news articles, videos are really, really exciting to look at. And another thing, which is not always considered, but I think really helpful as well, depending on, what's important to your donors and, what's really meaningful to your organization, is to potentially include some of those internal learnings, successes, challenges that your organization has had over the course of the year. And this has been really powerful, particularly in the past couple of years, with a lot of organizations that we work with, to talk about, what they they learned when they had to, pivot programming from in-person to virtual because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and what successes and challenges they experienced. But they were really still able to tell the story of how they served the community, just in a different way. The example that I have on the bottom is an organization called Air Ventures, and one of the ways that they did this, and it was really, really exciting and felt powerful to me, is that they conducted a survey. They're an organization that's based in Miami, Florida. And last year they conducted a survey of the technology and innovation sector of South Florida. So it was a really big survey. And they collected quantitative and qualitative data for like 11 months. This took them a long time, and they collected a lot of it. They went through that, analysis, and they really honed in on what they wanted to share. And then they put together a website that they intended to share with the community. And it included all of that quantitative, hard-hitting data that they collected, but they also paired it with quotes. They paired it with videos. I mean, they had interviews with members of the community, members of the sector, that were really exciting to see. And I got to sit in on a couple of sessions where they presented this information to different members of their community. And it was an incredible session because there were I think the mayor of Miami was there, and other representatives from her office. There were representatives from Microsoft. There were some social workers from the local community. It was a real variety of people in the Zoom room. And what was really amazing is that including the quantitative and qualitative data meant that every single member of the audience was able to engage with what they saw. They took something away, they asked a question, and that's really what's exciting and powerful about storytelling, is if you include both kinds of data, this mixed method approach, you're able to reach more people because everybody, is kind of interested in a different side of the story. And so that was a really powerful example for me to see, and one that I like to share with a lot of the organizations that I work with, because it's hard to collect both kinds of data in a really big, rich way. But just starting is that amazing place. Next, please. Thanks. And then the last step we like to talk about this is to iterate. It's not part of decal. Iterating happens throughout the entire process, but particularly when we're thinking about communicating impact to funding sources, being open to reflecting and improving on the process is really important. And so, discussing your goals, what you saw from the data, what you learned from sharing it with your team and with your partners, even if there are things that you're not necessarily totally comfortable with that you saw in your data, is so important, because it inspires action, and it opens up this road for collaboration, which we know from the survey and from some of the information that Annie showed us earlier is really important to the sector, and it's a direction that everybody is hoping to move in. Awesome. Oh, great. So that's the end of all the decal slides. It's a fun process with the organizations that we work with at UpMetrics. But like I said, I think that it's really consistent across the board when we're thinking about effectively measuring impact. And so we want to have a couple of minutes here to have a little Q&A with Rick and learn a little bit more, and give Rick a chance to share, what it's like to understand and use data in his role at the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. So I have a series of questions that I want to ask. And like I said before, if anybody has questions, please type them into the chat. But the first one, copies of the slides. Yes, I think that's all good. Perfect. I see head nods. Love it. So first question, I got derailed there. I'm sorry. Rick, can you tell us a little bit about how data impacts you and your team at New Hampshire Charitable Foundation? It's a big one, but I think we can learn a lot.
Sure. So I'd say the two main ways we share data are through, one, making a case for support, and also showing how qualitatively or quantitatively impact has been made with that donor's grant recommendation. So the donor made the grant, and how did things turn out?
And what are the, and who, I should say, who are the groups that you share data with? I mean, we know that you share data with donors. Are there other groups internally that you share data with before it kind of gets out the door to that end person or persons?
Well, we have a community impact team that gathers a lot of that data, and they're the outward facing grant out interface from the community foundation. So they're constantly learning from a lot of the nonprofits in the state of New Hampshire. And it is, it's just incredible how much data is collected. And then we try to work with that to get that out to not just donors, but potential donors, obviously, and professional advisors as well. And really any constituency that's just interested in learning how the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation works. We just want to make sure we are demonstrating our value, demonstrating our thought leadership, and demonstrating that we have that 30,000-foot view, and we're looking at the bigger problems and the bigger issues, I should say, to be addressed in the state, where obviously the nonprofits themselves, right down to the granular level, they're working on a very specific niche where we're looking at things like racial justice or environment or mental health or housing, or how to bridge the opportunity gap as it relates to kids, things like that, just something larger. So we're kind of looking at a larger problem to solve, and then figuring out how the data and the various interactive parts work together.
That makes sense. And it's kind of interesting because as you were saying that, it had me thinking about, I guess I am a really visual person, because it's kind of like that high level, like the forest versus the garden, and like really being in the ground level, like working with your hands. And it's interesting because I love that Martha said in the chat that the annual meeting is the best of sharing. And it's so exciting to hear that, because another, you mentioned a number of constituents, and some of those are, right, the nonprofits that are working with the community. And I think sometimes there's different kinds of data, right, that the nonprofits are interested in, and maybe the funders are interested in, but it's all really useful, and being open to sharing that across all of the stakeholders that are, really interested in supporting the communities across the state or across the region, it's just very powerful. So it's really exciting to hear that.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just address a question.
Yeah.
We'll just, Martha and Lauren both posting something about the annual meeting. Normally we would have our annual meeting in the first part of June, and it attracts about 800 people. It's a huge meeting we would have in Manchester. And for obvious reasons, in the past few years, we have not had the meeting because of COVID. We won't have that annual meeting this year. But just to speak to what Martha's talking about, we try to demonstrate very different stories on stage and have people talk about something that really shows the diversity of the different nonprofits we work with and we partner with. So that can be very powerful, because people go, wow, I didn't know that the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation worked with that group, or I had no idea that this was even something that was in New Hampshire. It creates a lot of awareness, which is good, right? Because it's not just saying that we work with them, but it's also saying those in the audience would say, maybe you want to support this cause as well. So it's sharing not only about the impact or what's been happening with those particular nonprofits, but it's also obviously attracting new audiences to help with that same problem or that issue.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm looking at the chat. James has a question about the
data. Yeah, follow up on that to the data NHCF gathers. Okay.
Yeah, and this is kind of a systemic question I'll ask. Just recognizing that we have a number of organizations represented here, volunteer organizations and organizations across the state, who are looking for ways to increase their impact or have more of an impact. I'm just curious, Rick, the data you're gathering at the Charitable Foundation, and I know we just talked about the annual meeting that shares stories of impact, but throughout the year, you have so much information about the impact of efforts going on and where there are gaps. How does that information about the gaps and the data that you've gathered, how does that get disseminated, or how is that accessible to all of these organizations that are working in all these different areas, who might be able to see a bit of data that you have and a gap that you've observed and say, well, we can play in that space, or we play in that space. We can have an impact on that.
Yeah, I guess I appreciate the question, David. I think the easiest answer I can give is we have senior program officers who are tuned in both geographically across the state of New Hampshire, and they're tuned in by subject matter. I had mentioned earlier some of those subjects, but again, environment, early childhood education, we have substance use disorder specialists, we have people who are focused on workforce development, and so on and so on, food scarcity. So those are the individuals we go to at the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. I say we internally and obviously externally, and they are the first source we start with to say, what kind of information have you been gathering and from what sources? And so that's the original go-to. And then if they don't have the answer, then they can work with the constituencies that they gather information from. But that all said, it doesn't mean that we have all the information. We are always looking for additional ways to gather the right type of information to make the impact that we're trying to make. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's really, I just think of those individuals in the community impact team as being the hubs, either geographically or by topic matter. And we are just constantly trying to get the best data to give to our donors, our potential donors, our professional advisors, and others, to make sure that they feel like we are a really good steward and a really good aggregator, so that they can feel like they're getting a point of view that they wouldn't get otherwise if they were out there trying to gather that kind of data on their own.
So that answers the question from the perspective of working with your donors. I'm thinking more of the perspective of, there are all these organizations who are trying to make an impact in the state, who can use information to help them to do their jobs as they make impact. And you have a lot of that information because you've got Sandeep and others out there gathering that information that right now you're providing to your donors. But how can volunteer organizations get their hands on that data or see that data on a regular basis, rather than having to wait for the annual meeting to see those stories, which are just the tip of the iceberg of the information you have?
I'd say to have those individuals go back to their liaison, whoever it is that they work with at the foundation, and start there. Say, what kind of information are you looking for as an organization? And then as the community impact team gathers it, they can provide that data. And as you said, we do that for our donors, but it's the same data. It's just data that we're aggregating for a donor who has a specific interest area, but maybe there's a nonprofit who's saying, we could make more impact, or we need to be more connected with other nonprofits because collectively we can do more. Of course, the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation is interested in making more of an impact in that way. So if we can be a partner and help these organizations connect with each other or get the information they need, and if we don't have it, to connect them without other sources, then we're all kind of on the same team in that way. We're all trying to move towards something positive for the state of New Hampshire.
Great.
Thank you for those questions.
I love the discussion, and it was leading to my next question, where we'd be talking about, do you ever find that data is missing? What kind of it's missing, and who do you talk about it with? But you did get me thinking about some of the experiences that I've had at UpMetrics working with organizations, both nonprofits and with funders who have this similar question. And it's often about going back to those sources and going back to those partners that the grantees have. And particularly if the funder is open to discussing and brainstorming what opportunities there are, we found that organizations are really willing to go back to their program officers and have those conversations and ask for support when they need it, especially if it is data. One of the foundations that we work with based in Kansas City did a quality of life survey for the local area. And it was really interesting. Last year, we had the opportunity to have a convening with the funder and a number of their grantees where they were able to share that data for the very first time with some of their grantees. And it was information that they felt like they knew anecdotally, but to actually see the numbers was very powerful. And then the other side of it is that, the data can be really unwieldy and it's really big. And so sometimes, figuring out what's the best piece of it to use for that organization's purpose becomes part of that conversation. And that's kind of like where that discussion went when we had that convening. And it was months ago, and that conversation is still going on and people are still learning from it, but just being open to being a partner, I think is like that first step and really exciting to hear about. So I love that question, and it's really relevant to the work that we do too. Okay, so I want to make sure, yes, okay, I want to make sure that we leave time for Q&A. There's I feel like we got to questions that are in the chat, but we definitely want to leave some time for questions that relate to these steps that we talked about in terms of effectively measuring and communicating impact. And so we want to open it up to all of you who might have questions for Annie and I, or maybe questions for Rick as well.
I'll just name Rick. I was just going to say, I was going to name one question here in the chat that I saw from Lauren, who's been posting a lot of great stuff. What advice do you have, I think, is for established organizations interested in scaling newer initiatives? I'm going to pose that back to you, Briana. What do you suggest there, or you, Annie?
It's going to be interesting probably to hear me go back to define. No, could you bring back the slides, Annie? No, I'm just kidding. Don't do that. But I think that it's really important. I was having a conversation with an organization recently that is going to be starting a new program. So they're kind of piloting it, but that first step was to really identify what their measures of success were going to be so that they could communicate them to the funder who was interested in supporting this program in the first place. And the more that those measures of success are being collected from the get-go, the better position, an organization is going to be to communicate what that newer initiative is doing and what impact it's having, so that they can potentially gather more capital, more funding for it. So again, I know it's sort of silly to go back to define and collect, but that's where I see a lot of organizations succeed, is just making sure that there's alignment on what it's going to look like to communicate the impact of this program, and just start to take a couple of steps to collect some of that information from the beginning. Annie, what do you think?
I completely agree with everything Briana just shared. I would also recommend to start small. So I like that idea of starting with the one program, and the challenge we all run into in this sector is we want to do so much and we want to do it all. And so we sometimes end up wanting to measure too much. And so I see that often with nonprofits, with funders as well, that we have 100 different metrics that we want to track to, right? And it's so hard to get to that and commit to that on a weekly or monthly basis. So starting with 7 to 10, and they have to be agreed upon across that program so everyone understands the importance of them. Everyone has to understand where that data is coming from. So how we're going to track to them, how we're capturing those stories, how we're capturing that qualitative information, and then growing from there. So seeing the 7 to 10 on a monthly basis and using that as a learning internally at your organization or externally, depending on how you're sharing that, and then growing from there. That's the only other thing I would add there, because even as an organization, we started with 100 metrics and KPIs to track, and we realized that we needed to just start with 10. What's most important, and then let's learn and grow from there.
That's great. I have another question in the chat from Lauren. Lauren is on fire. Do grantors enjoy links to videos that highlight programs? And then I'll go to Josh with a question after that.
So Rick, I'll take a stab at this one, but if you have any feedback on this as well. So I've spent the majority of my career on the funder side of philanthropy, in the past 10 years on the tech side of that, but always working with funders. And the thing that's always interesting is that we assume, and it's not anything personal, Rick, but we assume the funders have it all figured out and that they have the answers and they know what they're doing. And I don't have to say that to most of you. You know that they're a learning organization as well. And so some of what we need to shift, so the 803 that signed that commitment to make it easier to make grants and support the grantees they're working with, for that 803, right now they don't know how, right? So some of it is us teaching them, this is the way forward. This is what's happening on the ground in our community, the good and bad. We didn't achieve all of our outcomes. Guess what? Life has happened, right? But here's what we've learned and here's how we're changing. And if that gets delivered, Rick, in a video to a funder and they say like, this is not good enough, there's somewhat of a shame on them, right? But there's also this is what's important to you and your organization, how you're communicating information. And so we have to make that important to our partners in terms of how they're learning and consuming information. I could talk about this for a long while, but I was going to send it back to you, Rick, to see if there's anything. Again, it's like we have to teach them how to look at a dashboard instead of reading an 80-page report. The first grant report I ever read as a grant manager was 80 pages. And I was like, what am I supposed to, how is that helpful? You know, but they've been asking that of us all these years. And so now it's changing that dynamic.
Yeah, I'll just mention something around video that I've personally found effective, and I sent it off to Annie and Briana before today, and it was something that I swear to you just touches my heart every single time. And it was the story of a medical school student who's doing a personalized video. She's going to the University of Michigan, and this video won an award actually in 2014 for how effective it was. She's talking, and she's just talking to the camera, and what happens is she's talking to a specific donor. His name is Dr. Deno, who is the funder of her partial scholarship. And anyway, she keeps breaking up, she keeps crying. And she says, and it feels like raw footage. She says, I'm sorry, you'll have to start over. I'm sorry, I can't hold it together here. I'm very emotional. And somehow, some way, she pulls it together and she tells the rest of her story. But you saw all of this raw footage where she's crying and such, and it's very powerful. And then what they do in the video is they say, Dr. Deno cried too, and he did something unexpected. He funded the rest of her scholarship. He fully funded her tuition as a result of that. So that just shows you the power of video. He's helping one person that was important to him. And he did it, and then he went way above and beyond and finished the rest of the balance of what she needed to pay. So So with that said, I'll go to Josh because he's had his hand raised for a long time. He's very tired. I'm sure his digital hand is very tired.
Yeah, my virtual hand is so tired. I don't even know how to like turn it off here. Okay, here we go. Thank you. And well, just thank you. The whole conference has been so awesome, and this session also. So thanks. I'll just preface this that it's a messy thought. It's not a very complete thought and question. But what comes up for me, I think, Annie, especially when you mentioned about, a pitfall organizations can fall in is like trying to collect too much data and too many metrics. And I think we do that. And so I am so interested in like, okay, what are, like you said, the 7 to 10, like most important ones? And I guess where I get confused is like, it's like, sometimes I feel like I'm measuring data or metrics in order to segment our contacts for some kind of a communication strategy. Like that's one, thing. But then other times I'm measuring and finding metrics to report to donors or funders based on specific grant, outcomes. And then other times I'm doing metrics to tell the story, to leverage. And so it's like, there's all these like different reasons, and so they all have different metrics, and it just gets really confusing. And then I guess, the other piece that I'm thinking about is like, we're part of I'm thinking about coalitions and like wanting to like measure apples to apples so that you can, I think this was already discussed, like build a story together. And that's a whole nother like tricky layer. And then lastly, just to throw it all out there, there's, trying to identify the metrics that are meaningful to the sector that we're trying to impact, or like the area, that we're trying to impact. So like mission related stuff. No, I warned you. There was no clear question. I'm just,
There's a lot of great
sharing
questions.
all my messy thoughts.
There's a lot of great questions in there. It could be our 2.0 session that maybe we should have in the next couple of weeks. It's not easy. We probably should have started with that, right? It's not easy. I think a starting place for you could be on that spreadsheet that Briana shared. So when you look at the slide, you can just copy that into a Google Sheet or an Excel, and just start to ask yourself and then the organization questions, right? Of like, what is most important right now? And usually it's going to be around that donor. What are the campaigns we're running? What do we need to know? What data do we need to share out? I always thought, my hypothesis was that it was the program, right? It should be the most important, but we need to fund the program. So we need that donor or data up front.
Right.
The very simple way I'm going to answer your second and third question is to try not to go it alone. So if you're working with a coalition, so if it's other organizations that are solving similar or ancillary challenges, right? Like you may be doing transportation, they may be doing housing and job readiness or whatever that is, working from that same spreadsheet to say, here are the 3 things that we're tracking that are going to be most important for the work that we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
What are the most important ones for the work that you're doing? So having a consistent place with that coalition, and then within there, you'll learn what those measurements are that are important for that specific area and topic. So it's one way, and I'm gonna flip back to a previous question on the like foundation sharing information out there. We're working with a foundation in Detroit, who they and a number of other Detroit focused foundations are working on early education. And we started working with them maybe a year ago, and they were like, we're going to all work from this one playbook of data, right? We're a year in, and it's very hard. And so you have to balance the what's important for your organization with then what's that longer term priority as a group or coalition that we're going to track to. They're going to make great progress because they're actually going to start tracking, or they have tracking the measurements that are important to them. And then they're going to then share that out with the other funders and then share it out with the community of educators. So everyone's kind of working from this playbook, but everybody was looking for like, who's going to tell us the metrics, measurements that we should be tracking and results we should be having. And there isn't a playbook for that today.
Right.
Thank
Can
you,
I just-
Josh. Oh, go ahead, Briana.
Can I just mention, because I wanted to note that if you go back, Josh, to the slides and use the kind of example spreadsheet that we've used with some organizations, something to add like that column is how do we use this piece of data? And that's what will help you to accomplish the second piece of what Annie just was talking about. Is this something that I use? Is this something that my team uses internally? Is this something that we use to communicate out? And just adding that one extra piece of it is sometimes that can be what was missing because, it wasn't centralized or aligned, or maybe some other members of the team thought it was being used in a different way. So that might be helpful.